I had spent decades building a life for my family, carefully balancing work, responsibilities, and the emotional needs of my son, who had been the center of my world since the day he was born. The house we lived in was more than just bricks and walls. It was a sanctuary filled with memories of laughter, tears, celebrations, and milestones that marked our lives. Every corner, every room held echoes of birthdays, holidays, and quiet evenings spent sharing stories. I had poured my heart and soul into making it a home, a place where love and security were constants, even when life outside our doors was unpredictable. I had hoped that my son, the boy I had raised with unwavering devotion, would one day honor not just me, but the life we had built together. I had imagined him getting married, standing beside his bride, smiling, proud, and grateful for the guidance and support that had shaped him. I pictured the warmth of family and friends surrounding us, the joy in his eyes, and the satisfaction of seeing him step confidently into the next chapter of his life. But that hope was shattered the moment I learned the truth. My son's wife, barely settled into her role, had decided that the house I had nurtured and preserved for decades was now hers to control. She had moved her parents in without so much as a conversation, treating my home as if it were theirs to claim. The audacity of it stunned me, and for a moment, I felt my world tilt. How could someone so close, someone I had welcomed into our family, disregard not only me but the years of love, effort, and care that had gone into this home? I packed my personal belongings quietly, holding back the storm of emotions that threatened to spill over, knowing that any show of anger could be twisted against me, painted as irrational or emotional. I reminded myself that composure and strategic thinking were far more powerful than yelling or confrontation. As I moved my things into a small rental nearby, I thought about the power of restraint. There was no need to prove myself through words or displays of rage. The house itself, the memories it held, and the decisions I made in the coming hours would speak far louder than any argument. My neighbors looked on with curiosity, some expressing concern, others offering polite sympathy, but none of them knew the depths of my planning, nor the quiet determination I felt. Inside me, a plan was taking shape, a course of action that would reclaim not just my dignity, but also establish boundaries that could never again be crossed without consequence. The very next day, I realized, would be the turning point. That night, I sat alone, thinking back on all the sacrifices I had made. I thought of the nights I stayed awake when my son was sick, the years I worked tirelessly to provide for him, and the countless moments I put his happiness above my own desires. Every laugh, every tear, every milestone had been shaped under my guidance and care, and yet here they were, assuming they had the right to occupy my home, my sanctuary, without a single word of acknowledgement or respect. I knew the temptation to act immediately could be strong, but I also knew that timing, precision, and calm decisiveness would carry far more weight than an impulsive reaction. This wasn't merely about a house. It was about asserting my worth, reclaiming authority, and demonstrating that entitlement and disrespect would always have consequences. I planned each step carefully. Contacts were made discreetly, professional assessments prepared, and legal paperwork reviewed to ensure that any move I made would be both swift and irreversible. I reflected on the emotions that had been stirred, not just my own, but theirs as well. The arrogance of my son's wife and her parents, their assumption that they could claim dominance over a space I had nurtured, had created an opportunity. It was an opportunity to teach lessons in respect, patience, and the consequences of overstepping boundaries, without a single raised voice or confrontation. I knew the satisfaction of seeing the results would far surpass any momentary gratification from arguments or complaints. As the night wore on, I revisited memories of the house itself, the laughter of my son as he played in the living room, the quiet moments spent reading in the study, the family dinners where we celebrated triumphs and consoled failures. I reminded myself that all of these were not mere possessions, but a reflection of life, love, and the enduring effort of a mother who had given everything to her child. This reflection strengthened my resolve. I was not simply defending property. I was asserting respect, establishing boundaries, and preparing to act with a precision and calm that would leave no room for argument. I allowed myself a quiet smile, knowing that the next day would not just be about selling a house, but about reclaiming dignity and demonstrating the power of decisive action. The night passed slowly, Yet I felt invigorated rather than exhausted. The decision I had made was not impulsive, but considered, strategic, and inevitable. I knew that patience was key, and that the moment to act was now. My son's wife and her parents had assumed control, unaware that every move they had made would soon meet the consequence of overconfidence. And I, a woman who had endured, sacrificed, and persevered, would ensure that respect, acknowledgement, and justice were restored, not through confrontation, but through calm, intelligent, and deliberate action. By morning, everything would change, and the lessons they needed to learn would be clear and unforgettable. The next morning, I woke with a sense of calm determination, fully aware that the day ahead would mark a turning point not just for me, but for everyone who had underestimated my resolve. The house, once a sanctuary of laughter and memories, had been invaded by people who assumed entitlement and disregarded the countless years of care I had invested. But I was not powerless. I had spent the night planning every step, ensuring that my actions would be precise, swift, and irreversible. I dressed meticulously, presenting an image of calm authority, a composed exterior masking the storm of confidence and strategy beneath. Every move I made was deliberate, each gesture calculated to convey control without confrontation, strength without aggression. I began by contacting a trusted real estate agent, explaining the situation in careful, measured words, ensuring that confidentiality and professionalism were maintained. The house was evaluated discreetly, every detail examined to ensure maximum value. I took care to emphasize that timing was critical and that all communications must be handled with discretion, as the occupants were unaware of my next move. While this was happening, I reflected on the sense of audacity and entitlement that had been displayed by my son's wife and her parents. They had assumed that they could manipulate circumstances, that they could claim a home that was never theirs, and that they could ignore the authority and dignity of the person who had nurtured, guided, and sacrificed for them. Throughout the morning, I maintained a composed presence, interacting with neighbors and friends with polite smiles and casual conversation, careful not to reveal the storm brewing beneath my calm exterior. I listened as they commented on the situation, offering speculation, sympathy, and mild curiosity, all the while knowing that the true action was invisible to them. In their assumptions, they underestimated the power of patience, the quiet effectiveness of strategy, and the weight of experience. I knew that results would speak louder than words, and that my next steps would teach lessons in respect, consequence, and the consequences of entitlement far more effectively than any confrontation could. By midday, the sale process had begun in earnest. Legal documents were prepared with precision, ensuring that every signature, every clause, and every condition reinforced the inevitability of the transaction. My son's wife and her parents, fully believing that they were in control, remained oblivious to the reality that I had orchestrated. Their arrogance blinded them to the careful planning, the strategic decisions, and the years of wisdom that had prepared me for exactly this moment. I watched discreetly as they continued to settle into the home, unaware that the very foundations they assumed were secure were about to shift dramatically. Throughout the day, I reflected on the power of restraint. Anger, confrontation, and impulsive reactions might have offered temporary satisfaction, but I understood that patience and precise action yielded far greater results. Every phone call to the real estate agent, every interaction with potential buyers, and every review of paperwork was conducted with quiet confidence, a silent assertion of authority that required no words. I could feel the subtle shift of power, the invisible weight of control settling into my hands, and it was intoxicating, not in a vengeful way, but as the rightful assertion of dignity, intelligence, and foresight. I also thought about my son. He had been caught between loyalty to his wife and the recognition of my authority, and his discomfort was evident, though he did not yet fully comprehend the extent of my actions. I allowed him the space to realize the consequences of assuming entitlement, knowing that understanding comes more powerfully from observation and experience than from scolding or confrontation. My strategy was unfolding perfectly, demonstrating that respect, patience, and careful decision-making always carry more weight than rash words or impulsive acts. As evening approached, I observed the first signs of panic in their demeanor. My son's wife noticed the flurry of activity, phone calls, documents, and inquiries, but could not trace the coordination behind it. Her parents, equally unaware, began to question the assumptions they had made about control, realizing that their confidence had been based on arrogance rather than knowledge. I continued my work calmly, knowing that every step was reinforcing the lesson I intended to teach. Entitlement has limits, disrespect carries consequences, and true authority is demonstrated through deliberate, decisive action rather than empty threats or emotional displays. By the end of the day, the sale was moving forward smoothly. Every detail had been meticulously managed, ensuring that no loophole or argument could undermine the process. I allowed myself a small, private smile, savoring the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing that integrity, composure, and strategic thinking had triumphed over arrogance and audacity. The power of patience and the weight of decisive action had become evident, and soon, the lesson would be undeniable. I felt a profound sense of calm, knowing that the next day, the transformation would be complete, and the consequences of their misjudgment would unfold exactly as intended. By the morning of the third day, the tension in the house I once called my own had reached an almost tangible weight. I knew they were beginning to sense that the control they had assumed so carelessly was slipping through their fingers, yet they had no idea just how deliberate my actions had been. Every phone call I had made, every document I had signed, and every professional consultation I had arranged in the previous 48 hours had been executed with precision, ensuring that the sale of the house would proceed without resistance. My son's wife, full of confidence the day she moved in, was starting to realize that the situation was far more complex than she had anticipated. Her parents, who had settled in comfortably, were equally unaware that their assumption of authority would soon meet a formidable, immovable wall of consequence. I observed the dynamics quietly from a distance, letting the unfolding reality speak for itself. They scurried about, discussing potential plans, questioning what was happening, and beginning to panic, while I maintained my calm demeanor, the picture of composed authority. Every moment reinforced the lesson I intended to impart, that entitlement is fleeting, that respect cannot be demanded, and that actions taken without consideration of others' rights and experiences often carry unforeseen consequences. The power of observation became my ally, allowing me to see the panic creeping into their gestures, the hesitation in their voices, and the dawning realization that they had underestimated someone they thought they could manipulate. As the day progressed, I continued to manage the sale discreetly, carefully coordinating with legal experts and real estate professionals to ensure that every detail would protect my interests and secure the outcome I had envisioned. The process was smooth, yet the psychological impact on the occupants was profound. They were beginning to understand, perhaps too late, that the home they assumed belonged to them was never theirs to control. It was a house built on decades of effort, love, and sacrifice, and while they had treated it as a playground for their ambitions, I treated it with the respect and strategic consideration it deserved. My patience and planning were slowly revealing the stark contrast between impulsive arrogance and calculated authority. Throughout the afternoon, my son oscillated between concern for his wife's growing anxiety and the dawning understanding of his own misjudgment. I allowed him to witness the consequences of overstepping boundaries without directly intervening, understanding that lessons learned through observation are far more lasting than those imposed through confrontation. My role was not to humiliate or punish, but to assert what had always been mine: respect, authority, and control over the domain I had nurtured. Each subtle reaction, each moment of hesitation from the others, was a reinforcement of the quiet power I had wielded through patience and decisiveness. By evening, the first confirmation of offers began to arrive. I reviewed each meticulously, ensuring maximum value, while my son's wife and her parents began to grasp the reality of their situation. Their earlier confidence had dissipated, replaced by a mixture of shock, frustration, and disbelief. They had acted with arrogance, assuming they could claim what was never theirs, and now they faced the tangible consequences of their misjudgment. I did not gloat. Instead, I allowed the process to unfold naturally, confident that the lessons they were learning were far more impactful than anything I could have said aloud. As night fell, I reflected on the day's events, proud of the quiet authority I had maintained, the calculated strategy one had executed, and the dignity with which I had approached the situation. The house, while a material asset, had become a symbol of boundaries, respect, and the power of patience. I felt satisfaction not in revenge, but in the rightful assertion of control over my life and property. My son, observing all this, began to understand the depth of experience, patience, and wisdom that underpinned my actions. It was a lesson not just about property, but about life, respect, and the consequences of assuming entitlement without recognition of those who had invested so much in creating and preserving it. By the end of the third day, the sale was nearly finalized. The occupants were left to grapple with the reality of their assumptions, while I remained composed, quietly savoring the inevitable lesson they were learning. My dignity, foresight, and strategic thinking had transformed a moment of disrespect into a powerful assertion of authority, demonstrating that patience and decisive action often achieve far more than anger, confrontation, or impulsive reactions ever could. As I closed the final documents for the day, a calm sense of triumph settled over me, knowing that the conclusion of this ordeal would teach lessons that would be remembered far longer than any momentary insult or dispute could have lasted. By the morning of the fourth day, everything had reached its inevitable climax. The house I had nurtured and protected for decades was now officially in the process of being sold, and the occupants, the son's wife and her parents, were finally coming to terms with the consequences of their arrogance. The panic and disbelief that had begun to ripple through them the previous day had now solidified into a quiet, almost palpable tension. Every glance, every hesitant movement, and every whispered conversation revealed the dawning awareness that they had severely misjudged me and underestimated the combination of patience, experience, and strategic planning I had brought to bear. I moved with calm precision, reviewing the final documents, confirming signatures, and ensuring that every legal detail was correct and irrevocable. My son's wife attempted to approach me, her eyes wide with a mixture of frustration and pleading, but I did not waver. I spoke softly yet firmly, reminding her that boundaries exist for a reason, that entitlement without recognition of others' rights always carries consequences, and that the actions they had taken were inappropriate and disrespectful. There was no need for anger or confrontation. The outcome itself communicated every necessary lesson. I let the documents and the process speak, each step reinforcing the authority and control I had long held but had chosen to exercise with wisdom and patience rather than impulsive reaction. As the day progressed, neighbors and relatives began to notice the unusual shift in power dynamics. Rumors circulated quietly, and whispers of admiration and astonishment reached my ears. People began to understand that what had appeared at first glance as a minor domestic conflict was, in fact, a carefully executed demonstration of strategic thinking, patience, and quiet authority. They saw a woman who, despite being wronged and dismissed, had transformed the situation into one that not only reclaimed her dignity, but also imparted a powerful lesson in respect and foresight. My son finally approached me privately, his expression a mixture of guilt, astonishment, and reflection. I listened patiently as he admitted the oversight, the failure to recognize my contributions, and the misplaced confidence in his wife's entitlement. I did not scold or shame him. I allowed him to process the consequences of their actions, to understand that respect is not something granted automatically and that boundaries are established for a reason. The lesson, I knew, would last far longer than any argument or reprimand ever could. By evening, the final paperwork had been signed. The house, now legally sold, was no longer a physical part of my life, but symbolically it represented the restoration of authority, the assertion of dignity, and the triumph of patience and decisive action over arrogance and entitlement. My son's wife and her parents were forced to confront the reality of their overconfidence, and while it was uncomfortable for them, it was also a necessary awakening. I felt no bitterness, no desire for revenge beyond the strategic assertion of my rights. Instead, I felt satisfaction, calm and profound, knowing that the lessons they had learned were earned and undeniable. Reflecting on the entire ordeal, I realized that this experience had been about far more than a house or material possessions. It had been about teaching lessons in respect, establishing boundaries, and demonstrating that patience and strategy carry far more weight than impulsive anger or demands. I had turned a moment of personal violation into an opportunity for empowerment, proving that intelligence, foresight, and composure are often the most effective tools when dealing with those who assume entitlement. In the quiet aftermath, As the sun set and I observed the space I had once called home for so many years, I felt a deep sense of completion and pride. The ordeal had been challenging, emotionally charged, and even exhausting, yet it had reaffirmed everything I had known about myself, my strength, my wisdom, and my ability to act decisively when necessary. My dignity remained intact, my authority recognized, and my lessons in patience and strategic action had been imparted in a way that would be remembered long after the physical presence of the house had passed from my life. The experience reinforced a timeless truth. Respect, boundaries, and calculated action are far more powerful than anger, confrontation, or entitlement ever could be, and those who fail to recognize this inevitably face the consequences.